morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the Shadow Systems Foundation DR920 Combat. But before we get into the video, if you'd like to help me out personally, you can, of course, like, share, and subscribe, as that is all free and does help me out quite a bit. On top of that, there is my website, which does have some new stuff in stock. And there's also Subscribestar, which is basically just a pro to a Patreon. And while you're here, go ahead and comment your favorite Glock clone that does everything a Glock can do. Most things a Glock can do for less money, for more money in this case. But speaking of money, this gun was sent out to me by Shadow Systems for free, so I did not pay for it whatsoever. One of their gentlemen reached out to me, asked if I wanted to test out one of their handguns, and I, of course, said yes. There wasn't any money changing hands, but they did, of course, send this to me for free. Now, I've had this for several months at this point. I've used it in quite a few videos. I've filmed 2 reviews on it at this point, and I put about 1,500 rounds through it, and now we're ready to talk about it. Now, of course, there are some things that I think that this handgun does very well, some very fantastic features and design choices that went into it, and there are also some things that were not done so well, and some issues with it as well. Now, to be very clear, when I am very harsh on a product, even something that, again, there are some things that I do like about it quite a bit, it's because I do not work for the company. I am not in their marketing. I do not get paid by them whatsoever. In fact, I get paid by you guys to do this. So I work for you and not for the company. Now, if you bought one of these handguns and you want to cope about it in the comments, that is totally fine, but I am going to be as neutral as I can and be as honest about the flaws and the things that I like about it as well. Now, actually getting into the specifics on the Shadow Systems Foundation DR920 Combat Model R, this is, of course, basically a Glock 17 sized handgun, though there are some differences that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So, of course, you do have a 4.5-inch barrel, which is a very accurate barrel. We'll get into that later on. And you have a full-size 17+1 grip with all of the space for all of your stuff. If you have big hands, if you like shooting full-size handguns, this is going to absolutely fit that role. For my smaller hands, you can see that, there's a lot of extra space on the grip that I don't use because I do have smaller hands, though I do like shooting larger handguns. They are still a little bit easier for me to control. Now, there are 2 different models of the Shadow Systems Foundation DR920. You have the Combat and the Elite. They're very similar. The Combat, which this model has the simpler cuts, no cuts on top and no windows on the slide. The Elite model has cuts on top for more serrations, window cuts on the side as well, and it's 0.6 ounces lighter. So it has a little bit lighter slide, probably a little bit less reciprocating mass, of course, a little bit softer shooting. Other than that, they are virtually identical. So in terms of value, the Shadow Systems Foundation DR920 Combat is definitely going to be the better value when compared to the Shadow Systems Foundation DR920 Elite model. Now let's go ahead and start out with the best part of the Shadow Systems Foundation DR920 Combat, and that is, of course, going to be the grip module itself, which I think is basically perfect. So now, of course, this is a standard Glock 17 size, so you do, of course, have 17+1 capacity. If we start with the magazine well itself, it is flared and beveled quite nicely, so you definitely don't need an external magazine well, even if you wanted to use it for like competition style shooting. The reloads are very quick and easy. You have a very, very forgiving mag well that is filled up in the back, and like a Glock 17 Gen 3, where I have an insert in there so that the mags don't accidentally catch sometimes. Now, while it is a very usable and forgiving magazine well, it's also not too bulky. It doesn't add too much to the width and girth of the grip that it's going to make it more difficult to carry than it's already going to be just by virtue of being, of course, a full-size handgun. Now, moving up the grip module, we have very nice, very aggressive texturing all the way up the sides of the grip, as it should, so it doesn't stop 2/3 the way down. It does go all the way up, which I, again, personally like. We have very aggressive texturing on the entire front strap and on the entire back strap as well. Now, the back strap does have a different grip insert, so this whole panel in the back slides out, and you actually get adjustable angle. So basically, as I see it right now, it has a standard Glock angle, but by adjusting the thickness of the inserts, you can actually get a more neutral grip angle. Again, I shoot a lot of Glocks. I probably have, 20,000-30,000 rounds on Glocks or Glock-style handguns, and so I'm very comfortable with shooting them, and so I just left the Glock kind of standard-style backstrap on. However, if you like a more neutral, thinner grip angle, like a 1911 or something like that, you can absolutely swap that out to your personal preference. Again, I just left it here, but it is a nice feature that comes with it. Now, talking about the magazine release briefly, it is very low profile. It does have a lot of surface area on it. It is nicely serrated as well, so it gets good grip. while not being extended to where you're accidentally going to hit it. It's only raised off the frame maybe a millimeter, but again, because it has a very large surface area, it's still very easy to hit when you want it to. Now, moving up to your slide stop and slide release, this is fenced in. It is the more diminutive style, but it's not like a Glock 34 style where it has that little extended ridge in it. It is very low profile. It's still very easy to hit. It does depress the slide quite easily, even for my, again, smaller hands. And again, because the slide stop, slide release is so low profile and fenced in, I have yet to accidentally depress it when I don't mean to, so I get a failure to lock back because my support hand is too high or just pressing up against it. Again, it has worked every time without fail. Now, moving forward from there on the grip, on each side of the grip, you have these very nice cutouts with, again, the very aggressive texturing, which almost acts like a little bit of a gas pedal / shelf for your thumb. So you get a lot of good grip there and texture, and you can really dig in and press down because you do have just a little bit of a shelf there, which is something that, like, if you get a custom stipple job on like a standard Glock frame, a lot of the times they'll do that and cut into that area where your thumb will go to give you a bit more aggressive perch, if you will. So you can definitely get a ton of grip on the frame. Now, the accessory rail is a standard Glock accessory rail. I believe I've been using it with this TLR1 clone. This is one of the LAPGs. I have a couple of these for like 10,000 rounds so far, and they're still both working just fine. So as far as the grip goes, everything is basically fantastic. You have all of the texturing you could ever want in all of the right places. You have a very forgiving, flared, beveled magazine well that's not too obtrusive if you did want to concealed carry it. All of the controls are very good. Undercut on the trigger guard. You have a very nice beaver tail that allows you to really get up there and control that recoil very well. Unfortunately, the trigger is also connected to the grip, so we do kind of have to talk about that. Now, something that I have been seeing from a lot of other YouTubers that review the Shadow Systems guns is that they appear to be working in the marketing department of Shadow Systems, and they'll tell you that the trigger is supposed to suck. And it absolutely does not have to suck. However, it absolutely does in this case. So this is worse than or maybe not worse than a Smith & Wesson SD9VE, one of the first guns actually the first handgun I ever bought, but it's a darn close. Now, on the website, as I'm reading it right now, they claim 4.5 to 5 pounds of a trigger pull, and that is absolutely incorrect. If it was correct, that would be awesome, but that's not what we have here. Now, the trigger dynamics themselves are going to be very standard to a Glock, but worse in every way. So you have your normal amount of take-up. Now, the Shadow Systems trigger is a flat-face trigger. Don't really care about it all that much. Some people like it because of bigger surface area, fits their fingers better. Totally fine, but it's perfectly fine. I don't really care either way as long as the trigger itself is fine. So the trigger dynamics, you have that normal take-up and play. You hit your first wall, and you pull, and you pull, and it keeps moving. It keeps moving. Oh, there it goes. All the way at the back. It breaks at maybe 8 pounds. Now, you might be saying, hey, John, you just need to break it in a little bit more. Well, at this point, again, we're about 1,500 rounds into the gun, and I've also dry fired on it quite a bit, so 5 to 10,000 trigger pulls on the gun, and the trigger is still awful. It, again, is maybe not the worst trigger out there, but it's pretty darn bad. Now, I am of the opinion, oh my gosh, that Glock triggers are perfectly fine. In fact, I have a video coming up on just a stock Gen 5 Glock 19, and that trigger is pretty fantastic. It's smooth, it's crisp, it is about 5.5, 6 pounds. Perfectly fine for duty, self-defense, even target or competition if you really wanted it to. This trigger is very similar to a Glock trigger, but again, worse in every way. You have a grittier, stagier pull, as well as the fact that it's about 2 to 3 pounds heavier, and the reset as well is also kind of gritty. You can feel it pushing out, and then it eventually resets. So the trigger reset itself is slightly longer, maybe, than a standard Glock, even though Glocks have very good resets. This reset is just fine, but it's very gritty and stagey on the reset as well. You can feel it fighting itself on the way out. So again, in almost every way, the trigger is worse than it should be. And again, I'm somebody who's not really a trigger snob. If it's as good as a stock Glock trigger, that's perfectly fine. I used a stock Gen 3 trigger for many thousands of rounds, and I was perfectly happy with it. This is, again, worse than that in nearly every way. Now, we're going to get into a slight value discussion here, and that is going to be the fact that this is not an inexpensive handgun. My personal philosophy on Glock clones is that they either need to be better than a Glock or cheaper than a Glock. This is neither of those things. Currently, the lowest price that I found for this was somewhere north of $700, which puts it not only above most Glock Gen 5s, but most Glock Gen 5 MOSs, and unfortunately, above a plethora of fantastic carry duty-oriented guns that are going to be cheaper than this with far better triggers and other things that we'll talk about a little bit later on as well, because this is not an inexpensive handgun. Again, the grip itself is mostly fantastic. I really think that the trigger should at least be 2 pounds lighter to make it on par with the Glock trigger. Now, it would still be gritty and stagey, but if it was 2 pounds lighter, it would be much easier to use. Was I still able to use it and make shots out to 100 plus yards? Yes, absolutely. You can definitely get used to a bad trigger, but as somebody who understands that other guns exist, would I ever consider spending $700-800 on a gun like this when there are so many fantastic guns that are going to be much easier to use, much more fun to use for much less money, right? Now, moving on to the slide itself. Now, the slide is also going to be a bit of both worlds. You have very usable slide serrations in the front and in the rear, very deep scallops. It is very nice. The cuts up front allow it to go in and out of a holster very quickly. You're not really going to get snagged anywhere because it is very nicely beveled up front, kind of like a Gen 5 Glock, though not quite as round. It's a little bit more angular, a little bit nicer looking. Subjectively, it looks very nice. The other double-edged sword here is that it does have a ridiculously tight barrel to slide fit, which is going to cause some issues when we talk about reliability. Now, another very nice thing that Shadow Systems has done with the DR920 and most of their handguns is they do have a very, very good optics mounting system. Basically, it will accept just about anything directly onto the slide. They have redesigned the extractor channel to be shorter so that you can get full depth and really long screws, tons of contact area. Very, very well designed in that regard. One thing about it is not really a problem with the Shadow Systems cut, but on the Primary Arms RS10, I actually had to shave off like a 32nd of an inch off the back of the optic to get it fit in the cut, even though it is a Dr. footprint, and this should, in theory, accept Dr. footprint optics. The RS10 is a bit of an oddball, and I kind of had to, machine it down a little bit to actually fit, but it does fit very well. It does come with plastic shims for the front and rear for your different sized optics. So whatever optic you want to put on here, you definitely can. And again, they have those shims in there to make sure that there isn't any, lateral play in there. So again, it's very nicely secured with very good contact between the screws and the slide itself. As far as the optic cut goes, again, it is very versatile, very well thought out. I have no problems with that whatsoever. I've used it with several different RMR style optics, and this is a Doctor optic. I've also put on a 407 or a 507K on here for a little while just for fun. Now, talking about the iron sights briefly and the way they interface with the optic cut. So you get a blacked out serrated rear with just a square notch, and you get a white dot front. Very simple, but it works very well. On top of that, they are elevated, so they will work with every optic that I have tried so far. And again, I do like blacked out rear and semi-high vis front. I think that works very well. And so the iron sights that come with it, very well thought out, work very well. Optics cut system is low enough into the gun that basically every optic that I've tried so far does co-witness perfectly. But again, your mileage may vary a little bit there. So now we might as well go ahead and get into the double-edged sword that is the barrel to slide fit. And that is the fact that it's a little bit too tight and does not want to go into battery all the time. In fact, the very first round that I attempted to chamber in the gun, first magazine, Glock mag, I think it was Cellar and Bellet 124 grain ball, and it was a failure to feed on the very first round. Now, Shadow Systems does say that they have a 200 round break-in period where they recommend 124 grain ball, something hot to really make sure that all of the parts meld together nicely. I am not a fan of a break-in period on a Glock-style handgun. For instance, they are saying basically, hey, spend $700+ on the handgun, spend another $100 on ammunition, and you will get a gun that performs as well as a $500 Glock. That's kind of a no from me, dog. Now, the reason they do that exceptionally tight barrel to slide fit, which has caused 12 failures to feed so far, and in fact on the last range trip, which would have been around 1300 to 1500, I did have another failure to feed with 124 grain Cellar and Bella ball, so the issues do not seem to have relieved themselves. I have been told that it could be an issue with the extractor channel having a burr that was not removed. I would hope that would have resolved itself within 1500 rounds, but possible that there was a manufacturing issue with the handgun itself. See, even there, it didn't go into battery, and I wasn't even trying to get it to not go into battery. There. Now it's into battery. Anyways, so the accuracy that I was able to get out of it was pretty darn good. I did a couple groups with that Cellar and Bella 124 grain ball. I bought a lot of it, and so I use a lot of it. Now, the accuracy testing that I did with this handgun was using a bag. Actually, I have the bag around here somewhere. It's up there. The bag that I use is just a regular sort of bag that you lay the pistol down onto, and then you can shoot very consistently, very accurately with very little movement of the pistol itself, and at 15 yards. Now, the first group that I did again with the 124 grain Cellar and Bella, I got some very, very interesting flyers. It was about a 3-inch group at 15 yards with 2 touching and then 2 touching and then 1 somewhere in the middle, which was a little bit odd. I did another 5-round group just because I did feel that was a little odd. Again, remember, the gun is bagged with very little movement, and even if I'm pulling the trigger terribly, there isn't a lot of movement in the gun, even though I felt like all of those trigger pulls were good. On the second group, I got a group that I would think would be indicative of the gun's actual mechanical accuracy, which was again 5 rounds touching at 15 yards, probably about an inch or so, not terrible whatsoever. And then just because I had some other ammunition on hand, I also threw in some 115 grain Tula as well, and that shot in about a 1/2-inch group. All right. Whatever. I guess till ammo is match ammo now. Cool. Which is very odd, of course, because that's a very cheap steel case round. Funnily enough, I did put a couple hundred rounds of Tula through this handgun, and I did not have an issue with the Tula whatsoever. I did have issues with all of the different brass types of ammunition that I put through it. Just probably coincidence at that point. Anyways, the potential accuracy that you're able to get out of this is very, very good. However, the functional accuracy or the practical accuracy that you're going to get out of it, considering you have to fight the trigger every single time you pull the trigger, is going to be much lower than something that you're going to get out of even a stock Glock. Now, this is not a stock Glock in any way, shape, or form. This has a Timney Alpha competition trigger in it, and I did shoot these guns back-to-back on multiple occasions, and even though the mechanical accuracy on this is phenomenal, the mechanical accuracy on this with a AIM surplus slide and a 20,000 round Glock barrel on it, Gen 3 Glock barrel at that, is not very good. This will shoot like twice the size groups as this will. However, just because this trigger doesn't suck, this is far more functionally accurate than this gun is in, real world circumstances where you're not sitting with a bag pulling the trigger as slow and smooth as you possibly can. Now, when we talk about reliability, as we've already mentioned, I've gotten no less than 12 failures to feed with high quality ammunition. From round 1 to round 1500, every 100 rounds or so, you'd be getting a couple failures to feed, or at least 1 failure to feed, I should say, which was happening multiple times every range trip, and it would most of the time be when inserting a new bag, you hit the slide release, and it just doesn't have enough energy, because again, it has to overcome a very, very tight slide to frame fit, but also some of those other ones were just, it wouldn't feed the next round off the magazine. So while I do recognize that this is a very accurate handgun, you're able to get very tight groups out of it, the slide to barrel fit is again very tight. But what's the difference between a 1-inch group at 15 yards and a 1.5-inch group at 15 yards? Well, being reliable, apparently. So there is just something wrong with the slide to barrel fit being a little bit too tight, a little bit too much friction to overcome. Keep in mind that this handgun has been cleaned and lubricated twice at this point, which I never do with any of my Glocks. And on top of that, there might just be a slight issue where the spring setup, because it does have a bit of an interesting spring setup, just doesn't quite have enough force at the end of its cycle to fully lock back into battery, and it is very sluggish to get back into battery at times. Just whether you're just dry firing it or whether you're actually firing it, sometimes you can feel kind of just hitch before it fully goes into battery and you can pull the trigger again. Again, there is just something off in terms of its reliability, whether that be slide, barrel, spring setup, or like the gentleman that I talked to, the extractor channel might have a burr in it of some sort. Now, before I end the video, I should mention that the Shadow Systems Foundation DR920 Combat model does have a fairly interesting slide, barrel, and spring setup that is unique. And because it's unique, the other slides that I have here that are compatible, again, with Glock slides, do not fit on this frame, which is slightly unfortunate. I did want to, just for fun, run it with a aim surplus slide and ported barrel, just as kind of like a super budget race gun, because again, the grip is fantastic, minus the trigger. But again, because of the way that they have slightly changed up the design in the front end, it does not match with this slide frame combo, which is a little bit of a downside considering it's mostly a Glock clone with not all of the Glock compatibility. Again, a minor bummer. So at the end of the day, despite the fact that I do not particularly like the reliability or performance I was able to get out of the Shadow Systems Foundation DR920 Combat model, I do recognize that they did do a lot of things very well. There's almost everything about the frame I think is nearly perfect. It is a very, very good frame. The slide cuts, the optic cut, the iron sights that are included, very good. It is a very accurate system. However, if that comes at the cost of reliability, I would much rather have a gun that shoots slightly worse groups, but feeds anything I throw into it. Much the same with the trigger. If it was actually at the rated 4.5 to 5 pounds, not like 8 or 9 pounds, I would be very happy with it in that regard, because trigger dynamics aren't great, but it is a fairly standard Glock plus 2 pounds. Which is not what anybody wants to hear about a Glock clone. Now, again, when we get into a value discussion, this is a very, very hard sell. MSRP is over $1,000. Street price is, again, $700 to $800, depending on what model you're going for, which is going to be more expensive than most Gen 5 Glock MOSs, which are going to be more functionally accurate. They're not going to be quite as nice in terms of the grip. The slide isn't going to look quite as nice. The optic cut and plate system isn't quite as good as what you're getting here. But of course, the Glock is going to be cheaper, more reliable, more functionally accurate, better trigger, and did I mention it doesn't have a break-in period as well. So all of those things stack up to knock the Shadow Systems Foundation DR920 Combat out of competition with its biggest competition, which is going to be a Glock. There is almost, well, actually, no, there is no circumstance in which I would recommend this gun over a Glock. Again, a Glock Gen 5 of almost any model is going to beat this in the most important aspects possible, which are going to be the reliability and usability aspects. Again, it's also cheaper, doesn't have a break-in period, better trigger, so on and so forth. But again, it's also going to lose to just about every other handgun sub $800 out there. There are some truly fantastic shooting handguns, fantastically reliable handguns out there for sub $800, some of them sub $500. Smith & Wesson M&Ps are going to destroy this handgun. So many other guns out there are going to do so much better and cost you less money. So, at the end of the day, do I recommend the Shadow Systems Foundation DR920 Combat? Absolutely not. So, hope you all enjoyed. Let me know what you guys think of your Shadow Systems in the comments down below. I am aware that they have a ton of different models out there, and some of those other models might actually work a little bit better and be worth the money that they're asking for them. But that's not with this one. So with all that out of the way, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. Peace off.